This is Pat Simmons with Department of Health and Senior Services, and I just wanted to welcome and thank you for joining us today to learn more about making your strategies more inclusive of people with intellectual disabilities. And throughout building communities for better health, we've learned about the impact of chronic disease on people with intellectual disabilities and the need to make our programs be more inclusive of this population. And we started learning a little bit about ways to ensure that your programs are accessible, such as the webinar that we had on universal design last year. And so today we're hoping to add just one more tool to your toolbox to help you with this. So more specifically, learning to use the Universal Strategies Triangle as an effective approach to implement your chronic disease prevention plan in ways that are fully inclusive and accessible to people with intellectual disabilities. So yeah, just one little housekeeping note. Wanted to again thank you for taking the pre-survey that you should have received when you registered for the webinar today. And as a reminder, there will be a post-survey that you'll be prompted to take at the end, and also should receive a link via email after the webinar today. So with that, and also I wanted to encourage you to use your chat feature, and you know, as you have questions and such, put in the chat box. And as I mentioned, that Shelley really does want to try to make this as interactive as possible, and so you know, we do encourage your participation as we go through the presentation. So today's learning opportunity is presented by Shelley Reynolds, and she's an Associate Director of the Institute for Human Development at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She leads the National Community of Practice on supporting families of people with developmental disabilities, which is active in over 20 states. Through the Community of Practice and the Missouri Family to Family Health Information Resource Center, Shelley developed the Charting the Life Course framework and principles used to guide planning and problem solving for families, individuals, and professionals. Shelley provides training and technical assistance to agencies and organizations nationwide to help them use Charting the Life course to guide strategic planning, accessibility, and inclusion initiatives. And we're very grateful to have Shelley present this for us today. And with that, I will turn it over to Shelley.
Thanks, Pat. So welcome, everybody. I appreciate everybody taking the time out of their busy schedules to be with us today. I know it's a strange time for everybody, but especially those of you that are right there working on this day to day. So as Pat said, I hope that by the time we're done with our time together, that you will understand the Life Course Universal Strategies Triangle. I hope that you can apply this concept when you're thinking about really any target population, but of course today we're talking specifically about developmental disabilities, but I will also tell you about the larger application. And then I hope it gives you different ideas for outreach and engaging with local community members or organizations. So I hope that it not only gives you new ideas, but I hope that it validates for you all of the good work that you're doing, because a lot of you are doing a lot of wonderful things, and I think sometimes it's just celebrating that and remembering that. I'm going to take a few minutes to just sort of set the stage to give you some background on where this came from, because you know, when I was preparing for this, I was thinking about what an honor it is to have the opportunity to be in front of you, whether it's in person or online, because being a sibling of a brother with a developmental disabilities, you know, this is something that inclusion is something that is a part of our everyday lives, and thinking about how to help him have a good life. And so when I started to work professionally in the field, and it actually became a part of my sort of mission and the work that I do, you know, a lot of it started within the disability community. And as you're going to sort of hear from me, being able to actually break out of what I would call the disability bubble of the organizations and providers, and really thinking much more holistically in terms of how are we helping the whole community be inclusive of all of its citizens is really our ultimate goal here. Just real quick where this came from, so you have a little bit of background. A lot of the original work around the Charting the Life Course framework came from really working with people with disabilities and their families, and really trying to understand how can we support them better? What are their informational needs? What types of information do they need? And then that transformed into us working on what we call a national community of practice that moved into now 19 states, where we're working with the lead agency is the State Developmental Disabilities Agency, but they bring in many, many different stakeholders, the Department of Education, the Department of Health, Social Services in some cases, Voc Rehab, where we're really thinking about how are we transforming the sort of historical policies and practices around people with disabilities, and how do we really move those to be more inclusive. I'm a visual thinker and talker, so it's really hard just being sort of not in person with you, because I really love engaging with everybody. So throughout this our time together, you will see a slide when it says discussion up there. That's when I hope that you guys will have a discussion with us and we can have a conversation. But you'll see that throughout this are really just visuals to really help kind of reinforce some of the concepts that sometimes are often very abstract. One of the main slides that I like to use is the slide with these circles on it. And as many of you know, and you start thinking about, you've probably heard the social ecological framework. That's really what's sitting in front of you when you see these circles. And so if you look over on the left-hand side, we really think about, actually we don't take the time to stop and think about this, but each one of us can put our name in the middle of that left-hand circle where it says person. And so we could start thinking about our family and our friends. We might start thinking about the community that we live in. We might start thinking about all of the different things that really that we interact with. And so, we say the phrase, everyone exists within the context of their family and the community. And we sort of take that for granted. When we start thinking about systems change for people with disabilities, we start looking at that middle circle. And if we think historically about disability services have over the last 100 years, and we always talk about how we started to identify the needs of somebody, let's say, with Down syndrome or autism or cerebral palsy or traumatic brain injury, and we started to think about all the services that they need. We started in a way to wrap those services around that individual. Well, over time, we started to really recognize, as we really started to do that and create very specialized supports for people with disabilities, that it was those services themselves that are actually becoming the barriers to people having a life in the community, to having employment, to having friendships and relationships with their families. And so this visual that you see on the right-hand side is really the sort of ultimate vision that we have about how services and supports should really be implemented for really anybody, but especially for people with disabilities. We all want to maintain our relationships with our family and our friends. We all want to continue our roles or build our roles in the community. And how can we kind of put in services and supports in a sort of integrated support star sort of way that will really enable us to think very differently about how we offer specialized or disability specific services. We're not going to go through this today, but that star has become a problem-solving star within the China Life Course framework, where we really help people start thinking about their personal strengths, the relationships they have in their life, how they use technology, how they access community supports, and how they leverage eligibility or government-based supports. And so it's those things that we want to think about, how they help integrate and create the life somebody wants and doesn't become a barrier to that inclusive life that we're working towards. So as we started to recognize that if we're going to move from that middle circle to the circles on the right-hand side, that we cannot solve this problem by thinking the same way that we created it. And so we were all very well-intentioned in the disability field as we work towards building more and more services that would really support a person with disabilities. If you think about it, special education, we start thinking about inclusive employment opportunities and all of those sorts of things. So we continue to really try try to create these supports for them. But we recognize that if we're really going to transform policies and practices and communities, we really got to start thinking very differently. So we set out to really utilize the stuff coming out of MIT, where they start talking about transformational change. And we know that we can't just do things by changing a few words or changing titles of things and calling that more inclusive. We really need to fundamentally change the way we think about how we plan, how we include and partner with people of all types of abilities as we really rethink sort of inclusive future. So we recognized we needed a framework to really guide us. And so the Chart of the Life Course framework has many different sort of theories and practices that sort of kind of come together under this sort of visual organizing, I call it a visual organizing framework for really guiding our thinking, but it also can be used for planning either at a policy level, an organizational level, and it's the exact same framework that I can use to sit down and actually plan with the person with a disability and their family. So what does it become? It kind of evolved into a framework, some guiding practices, and some tools. And I'm telling you that because it's very possible you've maybe seen this green folder before. We print 35,000 of these green folders in partnership with Department of Mental Health, DESE, First Steps, MAC-DDS, and another of organizations that have different statewide resources for people with disabilities. And I point this out because some of the star and the different domains and life stages and the icons you see there are the underpinnings of the Life Course framework. So ultimately what we set out to do when we came up with this framework, and we said, well, we want to work on systems change in these 19 states that we're in. And the visual that we started to develop is we wanted to think about how are we creating and supporting a person throughout their entire lifespan to have the good life that they want, which is what the circle on the right represents. And what we recognize is that we can't just turn and work with the Division of Developmental Disabilities and disability-specific programs, but we really got to figure out how we're working across all of the community and government infrastructures. And so what you see there is how do we create this vision throughout all of these systems? That's where my excitement for this call today comes from, is that being able to, you'll see what I say, flip to the other side and be able to now work on the larger sort of public health arena is really how full inclusion is going to happen. So I'm going to flip to the next slide, but I'm going to tell you about 8 years ago, we created an analogy to help disability providers start thinking differently about how they partner. And so the slide that I'm going to show you was actually an analogy about, it was a flu analogy. And so what's strange time is that actually this flu analogy has absolutely come true. So it's very, very strange for me to be I'm sharing it right now. But so just imagine 8 years ago when I was working with disability providers, and many disability providers don't have the public health background that you have. They don't have this sort of public health way of thinking. And so much of their thinking is very siloed and what I would say in the bubble of really thinking about what people with disabilities and disability services and disability funding. And so I use this example to really help them understand that public health officials, and I will tell you this is a very generalized overview, but public health officials, as you know, we're trying to prevent everybody in the United States from getting the flu, because if everybody got it tomorrow, we know that the medical settings on that right-hand side of that triangle wouldn't have the capacity to respond to that. And so back before COVID, we had the flu shot. And what I was explaining to the disability providers is that, you don't always just have to go straight to your doctor's office anymore to get a flu shot. You can go to a CVS, you can go to the school or a community health organization. So there's these different organizations that sort of partner in that middle part of that triangle to really prevent the flu. And then you can even move to the left, and you can even sort of broaden your thinking and start thinking about, well, you know, businesses, if they have antibacterial soap inside the bathroom, in a way, that's a form of flu prevention, getting people to wash their hands and not spreading germs. And then I always say, if you take that even one step further and think about society going, ew, people, you're not washing your hands. So people just generally have started almost as this social sort of peer pressure of washing your hands. And so in a way, everybody owns trying to prevent people from getting the flu and needing to have this sort of medical intervention. The reason I use this example is that I said medical settings, hospitals and doctors' offices, they still, inside their business plans and their organizational change plans, still need to be the best that they can be when people come to you. They still need to be financially stable. They still have to have patient-centered practices and do all of those things. So they're not stopping and thinking about how can we be the best patient provider, while they're also hoping that those other parts of the triangle are happening. So the reason I use this to share it with them is I took this analogy to them and I said, okay, disability providers, Department of Mental Health, funding sources, on the right-hand side, if we really want full inclusion for people with disabilities, we've got to ensure that your policies, that your organizations, your staff are doing everything that they can to really make sure inclusion is happening. But we can't just stay inside the bubble of that green right-hand side. If you want inclusion to happen, you need to start looking at what are those public-private partnerships, for lack of a better word. Who are the other people that are focused on this and working on this? We know that special education, we know that there's parent organizations, we know that there's organizations that have adaptive equipment, or there's organizations that provide information. So there's lots of organizations that are all dedicated to the mission of full inclusion, even if they're not inside that sort of paid eligibility specific system. So how could those systems start working together and both working on that goal? But what was most important is we wanted to really push people over to really thinking about that blue side, that community and society side. So I said to a disability provider, you know, if you're thinking about employment for a person with a disability, you can't just go talk to your staff, and you can't just talk to VR and voc rehab. You actually need to go talk to those employers. Do they know how to include people with disabilities? Are they interested in including people with disabilities? Are their businesses accessible? But we can even take that one step further when we just start thinking about person-centered supports or family supports. And I always say, you know, if you go into a grocery store and they have an adult cart called the Caroline cart that enables an adult with physical disabilities to actually be buckled into this cart, that's a form of family support, because it enables a mom to take their adult child with significant needs to the grocery store and get groceries. Otherwise, she'd be pushing a wheelchair and a stroller at this, or in a cart at the same time. You start thinking about the more and more we educate police officers and first responders to how to be inclusive when they show up and they're responding to someone with autism or some other disability, because people are living in the community. You start thinking about the churches and the faith-based organizations or recreational organizations that are trying to do inclusive things. And each one of those parts of that triangle really are kind of doing all this in their own bubbles. And so the idea behind this triangle is to really push this sort of disability providers to start thinking about how their funding and how their projects and initiatives and the boards they serve on can start being around the other parts of the triangle. So I've worked with a number of county boards with developmental disabilities, and they've actually taken their budgets and they start organizing their budgets to realize if they just keep asking for eligibility specific supports, they're never truly going to make their whole communities inclusive. So this triangle's even been applied to looking at their budgetary. So what does this mean for you? And so Again, why I'm so excited for it is usually I start over on the green side and try to convince those stakeholders how to work across the triangle. But being on this call with you today, I'm able to start with you guys over on this blue side and say to you, now how are you partnering and engaging those on the other parts of this triangle? And so it's sort of flipping the triangle around. And that's really exciting. So there's a number of different ways. Every one of you probably have a pen and paper in front of you. Every one of you can draw a triangle that looks like that. And when you think about this, I'm going to show you many different ways just to apply that triangle. And what you're going to see over on that right-hand side, always on that smaller part, would be the target population that you're working at. Or it might be something that is more specialized. The middle is sort of the mixture, and the green starts the blue starts becoming the stuff that's for in the community for anybody, and not a specific population. So let me show you how I apply it to helping you understand the developmental disabilities population. But we work across the country to build triangles for aging, different diversities, all different things. So although we're doing this for developmental disabilities, this has application across any target population. The reason we started to do it is that the core belief of the Life Course framework is that we believe that all people have the right to live, love, work, and play in their communities. And so with that sort of guiding belief statement, we always talk about the concept of all, and that people with developmental disabilities are just a part of the all. And the more and more we think about them as actually being different than the all, the more and more we create specialized and segregated programs. And so that's really a driving sort of foundation to the universal concept. The first thing we needed to really understand, though, is who is the all within developmental disabilities compared to the rest of the population. And we know that people with developmental disabilities make up about 1 to 2% of all of the entire population of the US. And so that's about 4.75 million people with developmental disabilities across the country. The second thing we wanted to understand, though, is who's actually receiving Medicaid services, who's actually known by what we would call our state developmental disabilities agencies, because those are the ones that we predominantly think about when we think about who's serving people with disabilities. And we started to recognize that only 25% of that population is actually receiving DD specific services. That started to totally change the way we thought about how we needed to do and create inclusive lives for all people. So now let's apply this specifically to Missouri. So this is taking the triangle and helping you understand who's receiving state developmental disability services. We know with the census in Missouri that prevalence rate, there's about 137,000 people with developmental disabilities in the state of Missouri. We also know from that number exactly who the Department of Mental Health Division of DD is serving. So the numbers that you see that run down the right-hand side tell us that Missouri DD agency is only serving 25% of those people. So if you're thinking about partnering with people, they're a great start, but they might not represent all of the people in your county. They might not know about all of the people in your county. The other thing that you start seeing there, and some of the things is you start seeing that 14% is targeted case management only, or TCM only. That's about 19,000 people. So what does that really mean? Well, people that are only receiving case management means that they're getting a phone call from a case manager once or twice a year. And that means they're not getting any paid services. So they're not working with a disability provider. So if you're going to target that group of people, you don't go through, you can't really go through a residential or a day hab provider. You might need to work with your county board or your Senate Bill 40 or whatever the tax levy organization is that provides case management in your county. We start looking at what is community waiver. Well, community waiver is a home and community-based waiver for people with developmental disabilities in Missouri. And those 4,000 individuals are receiving services either in their own home or their family home. So they might have staff come into their home. There isn't a location or a group home that they go to. The comprehensive waiver is for those that are actually receiving residential supports. So you might find these individuals in a group home, or what we call independent supported living, so they're in an apartment owned by the agency. A very, very small percentage of those individuals are living in institutions or what we call rehabilitation centers in Missouri or nursing homes. And then you'll see there that another 2,000 people receive what's called a Partnership for Hope waiver. And what that waiver is for people living in their own homes. And then you see there's another 640 that aren't receiving services. So when you start thinking at your county level, it's really important to even create a triangle that breaks this down so you understand where people are actually living or being served, so that you know how to interact with them or how to do outreach with them. I didn't do the full triangle, but we took 2 of the counties that we know about and just used your prevalence rate and the census rate to tell you. In Randolph County, there's about 25,000 individuals that live in your county. Using the prevalence rate, that means there's about 400, give or take, individuals with developmental disabilities across the lifespan. If we look at Harrison County, we're talking about 8,000 individuals that live in Harrison County, which means you're talking about approximately 135 people. Again, give or take, because these are all just rough prevalence rates and estimates. But once we knew that, though, we needed to start understanding where people live. And all of this is really important. So if you're going to plan programs, you need to have some context into the number in your county, where the individuals live, the types of services that they receive, when you're thinking about, am I really including everybody I can be? So nationally, what do we know about the 4.7 million individuals? We know that there's this sort of assumption that people with developmental disabilities, when they age, they like move out somewhere. And typically the assumption for many Americans is they think individuals with Down syndrome and autism move out into a residential home or a group home. As you can tell from the statistics, that is not true. Only 11% of the 4.7 million individuals actually receive and live in some sort of residential placement. The other, add up the 75% that we don't know about, and the other 12%, you can really infer that that's about another 87% that are living either in their own home or a home of their family. That's important to you because if you're going to do outreach to individuals with disabilities, the outreach just can't occur through those inside placement. So this is just a rough statistic in Missouri based on those that actually fill out what's called a national core indicator. So these are people inside the state of developmental disabilities that are filling these numbers out. But it starts letting you see that we have about 1% in nursing homes, another 28% in group homes or residential settings, another 56% in their own homes that answered the survey, another 10% in their parents' home, and another 6% in foster care. And so these are sort of the settings that we think about when we think about people with developmental disabilities. But I also think it's really important when we're thinking about programs to also think about the different age of people with disabilities. Although this project is focused specifically on those that are adults, they are a certain age before they become an adult. So how are we actually thinking about them in early childhood and school age, thinking about being healthy and eating well and not using tobacco and all of these many things, and how that can then really take its trajectory into adulthood and into older age. So you can take these numbers and really start thinking about youth with disabilities in the state of Missouri, as well as those that are adulthood and aging. And so you can even break these down at a county level to help you realize, okay, if I'm doing youth, if I'm doing some sort of outreach or program to youth, I need to be thinking about the number of youth with disabilities, different from how I think about adults with disabilities. And so the life stages help give us another way to really think about this target population. So at this point, this is how we use the triangle one way to kind of think about people with developmental disabilities. This is a discussion slide. So I want to just take a minute. I'm going to pause, and I'm curious if there was anything there that surprised you, something new you learned, something that validated for you, or any questions that you have. So I'm gonna, you've got the chat feature. You can, if your camera's on, you can put your hands up and we'll probably see you. So somebody like to share. And you can use your, I think, Catherine, they can use their space bar to press down while they're muted, and it'll unmute you. I hope that somebody learned something in that last 5 to 10 minutes, and I'm not going to move on until I hear that you did or had a question. You were surprised by the number of individuals with IDD, Cindy? Yeah. Was it more or less than you thought? More?
Yeah, it was more than I. Sorry, it takes me a little second with my. Yeah, it was more than I expected, or than I thought, and also the living situations. I guess I hadn't really considered all the different places where people are residing.
Yeah. Well, good. Others? Dana Hall, your face just popped up on my screen. Would you like to share? I hit the space bar, please.
There we go. Yeah, I was just, I was surprised by all of the information as far as like what the steps would be, and some information you gave as far as what we don't really realize in our own communities is that the individuals that are ADA or disabled, what they really need to go ahead and figure out where are our jobs and how that can work with either our Chamber of Commerce locally. Who can we get on board to find that information? So that was kind of a good information that you brought out.
Great. I'll take one more and then I'll move on and show you another way we can think about the triangle. And I can't see everybody on my screen, so I don't know if Catherine, you see other people on your screen. Or that wants to put something in the chat. So Kayla, you said the living situations surprised you, just like with Cindy. Excellent. All right, I appreciate those that spoke up and see it wasn't so bad. So now I'm going to kind of move on and kind of share with you now thinking much more structurally using the triangle. And so before I get started, actually, I forgot I had this slide in here. I'm going to open up this. When you guys think about people with developmental disabilities in your community, and if you had to think about the organizations that you would call when you needed to work with these individuals, share some of those organizations with me. Either write it in the chat or kind of, you know, unmute yourself and share. So tell me some organizations that you would reach out to if you knew you needed to reach out to organizations that serve people with disabilities. I'll give you a minute to either unmute or write it in a chat. And it could be the specific name or the general name. DD Council, yep. Senate Bill 40s. Sheltered workshops. Oh, good. Independent living centers. A provider organization. Cross lines. Yep. Independent living centers. Exactly. Creative Pathways, which I'm guessing is a provider organization. Adult care, which is probably a day hub provider. Exactly. So when we first start thinking about disabilities, and you can obviously offer more, but I'm going to kind of move on. we start thinking about different, like, so if I had to start filling this triangle out for you, and you can almost, what I want you to think about is if you were to sort of just draw this yourself, you know, if you were just to draw a triangle and you were to think about the right-hand side, and you started to list everything that came to mind when you think of this sort of formal government or formal system of providers of people with disabilities, you would list them under the green. So you would list the creative pathways, the adult day hub centers. You would list, we call them Senate Bill 40 boards or county boards. And I don't know if everybody's familiar with those boards. There's not one in every county, but there is one in most every county. And the reason it's called Senate Bill 40 boards is that is what Senate bill passed the tax levy back in the day that enabled county boards to collect taxes specific to programming for people with developmental disabilities. So the counties that do have these programs, all of them look very different. Some of them provide case management. Some of them actually run provider organizations or the sheltered workshops. So they're all very, very different. And then just to confuse everybody anymore, they all have very, very different names. So in Kansas City, it's called ETOS. In St. Joe, it's called Progressive Community Services. In St. Charles, it's called the Developmental Disabilities Resource Board. So they just continue to confuse people as much as possible. So you don't really understand, you know, do you have one? If you have one, what is their name? And if you do have one and you figure out their name, what is it they really provide you? But they're an important part of our infrastructure. The other things that fall under there would be different residential providers. So if you do have residential providers in your county or habilitation centers or adult day hub centers, you know, those are different parts of the system as well as sheltered workshops. So these are places that are very specific to targeting and supporting people with disabilities. But there are other types of systems like you mentioned. So the independent living center is another system. Many of those families that you saw are individuals that live in their own home. They receive services through what we call personal care attendants. And so those might just be paid community members that they identify, they hire them, they're their employer of record, and they come in their homes. And so there isn't a formal structure to really kind of get information through a provider organization. So that's what we think about when we think about the green part of the star. So I'm bringing this up for you for a number of reasons. Is one, here are places of people that should be on your coalitions. These are organizations who you can reach out to if you're doing outreach and trying to do programming. But I don't want you to stop there. I want you to also think about, if I had to fill out a disability specific triangle on the DD network, here's some of the other things I would write down. I would put special education. And the reason they're not over on the green side is because they're not a medicated direct service, long-term service provider. So special education, voc rehab or vocational rehab, Special Olympics, parent organizations. So maybe you have like a Down syndrome society, or maybe a group of moms have formed an autism support group or an online chat room. People First is the adult self-advocacy movement for people with developmental disabilities. And years ago, I supported the statewide People First chapter, and there were about 50 local chapters. So you might have a local chapter in your community. You might have some programs that are autism, school specific or therapy specific. Or maybe there's churches that are really thinking about programs that include people with disabilities. Maybe there's a specific mass where people with disabilities run the mass. Maybe there's a specific, you know, a Bible study program. There's also programs very specific, recreation types of program. So again, there's organizations that aren't necessarily in that formal paid Medicaid infrastructure that very much believe in inclusion. So how are you tapping into those organizations? And again, this is not just you. every one of these parts of the triangle essentially silos themselves and sort of doesn't necessarily always cross in well with the other. And the idea behind the universal strategies is how do we actually help everybody help one another in terms of the overall goal. So now we're going to take it one step further and think about what exists in your community that's really doing things that are fully inclusive that you're maybe not even thinking about. So, you know, are your first responders trained to respond to people with disabilities or autism? You know, do you have the a grocery cart in your, the adult cart in your grocery store? Are there churches that have fully inclusive congregations? They're not just creating this sort of disability specific program, but they're fully inclusive. They're accessible in terms of how you get into the church. They're accessible in terms of people with disabilities have many different roles inside that church, just like all the other members. You know, are the YMCAs, are they fully inclusive in addition to running disability specific programs? And so as you see there is this, again, my excitement for today is I can start saying public health departments are really thinking about full inclusion and what that really means in terms of that. And so you put that whole triangle together, those are some of the organizations that you should be thinking about. So when I'm forming an advisory committee, I always get this triangle out and I say to myself, am I just going to my old, the old organizations I'm used to and that I know about over on the green side, or am I really pushing myself to think about other people that care about the mission of full inclusion? So I didn't have that slide there for discussion, but I'm going to open it up for one or two responses to any feedback, surprises, additions that you would add to that, organizations I maybe didn't think about, or any questions that you have. So again, use your chat, or if you're on camera, wave your hands or unmute your phone. If you're just on the phone, please just unmute your phone. Let's get 2 or 3 and then we'll move on. I can actually go back to it if you want. Any surprises, or is there an organization in your local community that you thought of that you maybe hadn't thought of before? Did that trigger anything for you? My plan is to be done early today if you guys would actually help me move on.
Hey, in our church, which was kind of, we have 2 different entrances, and we have some people that were recently in their wheelchair bound. And so as far as including them, they've had to make an area, which I never really thought of before because I'm not disabled in that area. And they've had to bring them in and then they take them out so they don't go in front of the congregation. So there's, you know, we all have respect for ourselves and for others, and so to make sure that they're included and they're not excluded in any shape or manner, they come in a different way, and then they're right there, and it's like, oh, how did they get there? Well, we've made that in the church, so they're included in that. They're already there. Nobody saw them come in, and so they're just like one of everybody that's sitting there. And so I thought that was kind of a cool thing that one of our church actually did and put in place.
That's great. Thanks, Dana. And I see Alicia said that the YMCA is a great place for inclusive recreation programs. What other idea it might have spawned for you? Nightlife dance clubs to have a night for the persons for people with disabilities to listen to live bands in Camden County. Great, thanks, Marie. So this is the second way to use the triangle. So that first way was you can help really think about the target population you're working with. So, you know, if you could have used, I used it for developmental disabilities, but over on at a population level, you could put, you know, if you were trying to be more, do more outreach to the Latino community, you could put them as the green part. Then you would take the second triangle like this and use it to start thinking about the organizations or the structures that exist inside your community that might help you do outreach or help you partner or think about that population you're thinking about. So this is the third way to use the triangle. And this is applying it very specifically to your public health programs. And this is where I really am going to need to kind of also hear from you. So when a number of you have been thinking about this for a long time, or because of this initiative, it doesn't matter the length of time, but give me an example of programs, a public health initiative that you've done very specifically targeting people with developmental disabilities. And I know what county health departments are on the phone, so I can even start calling on a couple health departments. So, you know, I'd love to hear from, I know that Harrison County is on the phone. Would you like to share any of the programs that you guys are looking at specific to people with disabilities? I don't have your names in front of you, but maybe Pat or Catherine has the actual names of people.
I'm going to unmute
all the phones.
Well, not all the phones. I was going to randomly pick somebody.
Okay.
But I'll try all the phones. I just was worried about feedback.
Yeah, no, go ahead and just randomly pick. We can randomly pick 3 people.
I was going to say, this is Pat. I don't think that actually I see anybody from Harrison on the call this morning. They may not have been able to join.
Oh, okay. So then we're just going to have to randomly pick from the list of names that showed up, right, Catherine?
Sounds like a plan.
All right.
I'm going to try Brenda, because I know there's a few people in there, so maybe she won't feel quite so alone. So the crew from Ozark County. Brenda, you are unmuted.
So Brenda, the question was, what are some specific programming that you've focused on for people with disabilities or have thought about?
Or if Rhonda or Susie want to answer from there because they're on the same line.
Oh, they don't have a microphone. Okay. I guess you guys get out of that, Brenda. You guys can also always call in too if you don't if you wanted a mic. But so we'll have to ask somebody else then. Catherine, please. Yes, Marie, place in chat.
Or I've unmuted you, Marie, if you would rather talk.
I was just going to suggest that Brenda could place her answer into the chat.
And while Brenda potentially does that, let's try Marcia.
So Marcia, any prep?
Are you ready for me?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the main thing we're working on is the accessibility, doing the design plan for the city, taking one city block that we know has multiple issues that are barriers, and doing a design plan for that, and then having that for a template for the city to use that then in other areas. But for example, this block that we're working on has a medical clinic. It also has the public library. So we've got moms with strollers. We've got a low-income housing facility that has to go past this block to get anywhere. So we're looking at working on that block as a template and doing a design plan for improvements that would increase the accessibility.
That's great.
That's great.
So you're looking at a number of different things, and not only sort of for people that have mobility accessibility issues, but you're probably thinking about people who might be blind or hard of hearing, or and doing that at a city block level. That's great.
Thank you.
So Brenda, they're looking at
walk.
let's get one more share of what people are thinking about when they start thinking about programs that they're working on or initiatives they're working on. We're going to have to call on one other person, Catherine.
Maybe. Let's try.
It's like the waiting game. Am I going to get called on or not?
Hillary.
It's Hillary, you said?
Yes.
Hillary is one of our DHSS staff, so maybe
Oh.
you know.
Yep. Choose somebody else. There's only a couple that are non-county.
How about Darby?
Darby French, what programs are you guys working on around including people with disabilities? So Dana and Henry County is working on livable streets policies.
Yes, we are.
Excellent. All right. So those are some really great examples of thinking about different programs for people with disabilities. And Christy said there's a couple of counties working on nutrition and cooking classes that are accessible to people with disabilities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of skip some of those slides. I'm going to move to helping you kind of think, take that thinking. Actually, I wish I had a slide that had built it all together. When we start taking this triangle, I'm going to make you dizzy for 1 second until I get to the slide that I wanted. Kind of putting these things together, when you're thinking about your planning and developing programs, you know, you guys do this all the time, and you don't even really probably think about it. So if you were working on a project, let's say, and you knew the initiative was related to, let's say, maybe it's related to youth, and it's youth bullying, or it's youth decreasing use of tobacco use. You in your head automatically start thinking of, okay, I've got to think like a youth. How is the information gonna be something youth want to, because what a youth wants to see in the videos and the information they want is going to be very different than someone who's 55. And so you automatically start thinking about that population. I will tell you, for some reason, when we start thinking about people with developmental disabilities, we get stuck. We just freeze. We like sort of panic, and it's sometimes a panic of the unknown. And so the whole idea behind this sort of way of thinking is to sort of decrease that panic for you and say to you, you guys, it's not that different than when you're thinking about any of your populations. If you knew you were going to work on, let's say, something on caregiver abuse for people in the elderly field, you would design the brochures you would make, the videos you would make, the programs you would develop would be designed very specifically to the way older people think and the things they like to read and how they like to get their information. So when you think about people with developmental disabilities, you guys are really information conveyors, right? When you're building stuff, or when you're developing programs, or you're thinking about developing an accessible block. And so you just start thinking about what are some of the barriers that people with disabilities have, and forget their disability for a second. Their actual diagnosis is irrelevant at some levels. And so if you think about people with cognitive or intellectual disabilities, it's an overgeneralization, but you could probably think that they probably have low literacy, right? They may or may not be able to read. So no matter what products you develop, are you developing them using health literacy principles? And if you're developing products that you're for anybody with health literacy principles about using images and not many words, or, you know, even if you're thinking about those that don't speak English, there's lots of principles you apply to make people able to understand your information. anytime you do that in any of your programs, you are making your program universal and accessible to people with disabilities. And so you could probably sit here right now and say to me, oh yeah, okay, Shell, you're right. So when we were designing this program, you know, we made sure those that couldn't read had an image or a video where it said it for them. And so that's the level of thinking when we start thinking about developmental disabilities. They might have barriers because of mobility, but as you were addressing this in the street example, people have either mobility issues and need to use a wheelchair, maybe they use a cane, maybe they're pushing a baby in a stroller. So if you're making sure people can get inside your buildings for any of those reasons, you are creating an inclusive environment for people with developmental disabilities who may have mobility issues. If we start thinking about the other things that people often get sort of unsure about with people with developmental disabilities is, one is the communication, which we already addressed in terms of the printing and reading and health literacy. But how do people communicate? Are they using a computer to communicate? Do they use sign language to communicate? Or, you know, sometimes our fear of people with developmental disabilities is because they act different. So do they have sensory issues, or do they maybe have some different sort of behavioral triggers that you're unaware of? And so forgetting the label and just thinking about the way you interact with anybody is how you should think about people with disabilities. But when we start thinking about this, I know that one of the group's goal is to think about increasing physical activities. I thought it would be interesting for you to see that one of the things that we're constantly doing is looking at the data about people with developmental disabilities compared to the data of the general population. Because oftentimes people with developmental disabilities either get thrown into the general population data and you lose any of the differences, or we always talk about the big D, which is disabilities, and within disabilities is physical disability, aging, developmental disabilities. So sometimes people with developmental disabilities get lost in our statistics around disabilities. But I thought this was sort of a fun statistic in that looking at the Healthy People 2020 goal for the state of Missouri is 48%. Missouri's at 49%. And then when you look at the data coming out of the Department of Mental Health, when they ask that same question, they're at 49% as well. So they're somewhat physically active as compared to the general population. So that's interesting when we're looking at data. Then when we start thinking about applying this triangle to your programs, so some of you mentioned some programs. Actually, the programs you mentioned are over on the blue side and the purple side, which makes me really, really happy, because the more and more as a public health organization, your programming is just universally designed, it will hit more populations of people who can't read, who have sensory issues, who have physical issues, who also may also have a label of a developmental disability. So for example, what are the differences between these three types of programmings? First of all, on the right-hand side, if you have a program where you're going to go and do an exclusive class for people with developmental disabilities, let's say in their group home, that is one form of outreach to this population. But as you know from the data we already showed you, that's not going to reach all people in your community with a developmental disability. So that's one step. It's an okay step. But as we move more and more into full inclusion of people with disabilities in our community, that's not the most inclusive program, but it's a great step. Then if we move to the left and we say, well, how are we intentionally including people with disabilities? So it's still it's targeted, right? So maybe you decide to host a yoga class for people with developmental disabilities, and you ask them to bring their aging parent, because you know they also have physical activity issues you want to increase. Or maybe you host a yoga class and you ask them to bring their younger sibling, because you also want to engage youth. So you're very intentional when you're building this program to target people with disabilities, but you do it in a way that's more inclusive of a segregated program. Maybe you also do it at the community center. And so it's a mixed group of people. Maybe it's a bunch of people that live at home with their parents. And so you're trying to motivate those aging parents as well as those that they might be caregivers for. And so that's a different way of thinking about your programming. So I'm sure you guys do stuff like that all the time where you're doing mixed generation programs. You can think about that mixed target audience with people with disabilities. You can also then, even if you didn't do those other two things, every program that you develop, how are you making sure if you're going to host, let's say, a exercise class in the park, are you making sure the park has a way for wheelchairs to get there? Are you making sure if somebody shows up and needs sign language that there's an interpreter there? Are you making sure that everybody knew about the class, including people that live in group homes or in their parents' homes or whatever? So the way that you do anything that you do should have this mindset of this universal concept, this universal design of outreach, of program development, of those things. But you also can be very intentional. So, one of the activities, if you have a coalition that's looking at disability and health, you could use this triangle with your coalition, and you could say, what are the health-related programs that are targeted specifically to settings where people live with disabilities? Where are the programs that are targeting that middle purple area? So did the YMCA host something? Did you guys host something? And how is it sort of more inclusive? And then how are things you're doing for the whole county? If you're hosting a county fair or those types of things, how are we making sure when people show up, they can participate? So that's another way to look at this triangle. So you can also apply this to, I just wanted to show you statistics around, I know some of you have tobacco cessation programming. And so I thought this would be an interesting statistic for you. Out of 393 people with developmental disabilities who receive services from a state DD agency, so again, a very small target group, 9% of them use tobacco. And so when we think about people with disabilities, don't forget them when we start thinking about alcohol, nicotine, tobacco. They are users of these as well because they are a part of your community. And so just because they have a developmental disability, do not assume they're not having access and utilizing some of these things as well. So if you're running one of those programs and now all of a sudden you see the statistics, you need to say to yourself, well, 9% of whoever might be, if I'm in that one of those counties where there's 135 people, 9% of those 135 might be utilizing nicotine or tobacco. So there is data to help you also reinforce why you might be doing programs. So if you are doing a tobacco cessation program, you can use this triangle and to think about it. And really, you should use this triangle for any program that you're thinking about. So we're trying to flip this so when you think about inclusion, you're not doing it secondarily, going, oh, I need to do a triangle to get to those people with disabilities, but rather you do most of your energy in the blue part of this triangle where you're like, every one of my programs need to be universally designed. So I don't know what you guys do related to decreasing tobacco use, but you could think about it now. Are your materials, are the offerings and programs that you have related to tobacco cessation, are they accessible? Would a person with a developmental disability want to go to that program? Or in addition to that, are there more targeted things that you need to do? Do you need to do outreach to people with disabilities that live in that's very specific? Do you want to do something intentionally inclusive of people with disabilities and others? I will tell you right now, from my experience in working in the field for the last 20 years, the people that provide direct supports to people with disabilities, most of them are obese and most of them smoke. And so if you're wanting to do a mixed programming for people with disabilities and they live in your county, you've got the people that support them and you have people with disabilities. Bring together and figure out some way to do a health program that you talk about, nutrition and you also talk about tobacco use. And it's not just targeting the person with the disability, but it's targeting the people around them as well, their family members, the direct support professional. And that's in that purple area, very targeted approach, but those are people that live in your county too. So they're hitting kind of your concept of law. So in light of the pandemic we're all living in right now, there's probably no way that you're not also thinking about people with disabilities. They are a vulnerable population. I know this probably was, I thought I would just slide this in here because I know that's where many of your minds and your work and your energy is right now. And so you can take this concept and you can apply it specifically to the activities you're doing that are COVID related. So, if you're working on a food drive, are you thinking about people, people with disabilities, not only in those group homes or those residential settings, but all of those people with disabilities that are living in their family home are probably living in poverty, because in order to get Medicaid waiver services, unfortunately, you're living in poverty. And so do they have enough food? Do they have their basic needs met anytime, but especially during COVID? The little amount of money they might have been working and making from their jobs, they might not be making it anymore. Or flip that around, maybe those individuals with disabilities are needing to continue to go to work. Sheltered workshops, last I heard, were deemed an essential organization. So many people continue to send people with disabilities to sheltered workshops. Were they practicing all the precautionary things that you're teaching? Do you have, move over to the blue side, do you have, is all of your messaging and all of your prevention education, is it accessible? Do you use health literacy principles? Do you have a lot of images that don't use a lot of words? Do you have some videos? How are you getting that out and really targeting what we know has been deemed a very vulnerable population and hard to ignore in the midst of this pandemic? So you can use this triangle just even as an image in your head as you're thinking about every one of your responses that you're working on. So I'm going to pause right there and I'm going to open it up to sort of any of your, what I would call throughout the three different ways that I talked about the triangle. In some ways it's very simple, in some ways it can be very complex. I hope that I showed you how the triangle can really guide your thinking, even if you're writing it or not writing it or just thinking about it. But I'd like to kind of open it up to quite a few what sort of ideas did it generate for you? Did it give you some new ideas for partnerships? Did it help you sort of trigger some thoughts about how you might think about something differently? But I'd like to hear from you. So either writing it in the chat box and we can unmute each phone as we go down. We see all your names here. So, or people can just volunteer to get us started.
Well, this is Cindy again. I really thought that was a very interesting point about that a lot of the care providers are folks who are at risk for poor health, and how that can translate to putting the clients that they serve at risk as well. So I hadn't quite thought about that, but I think that's really a very interesting point.
Yeah, and sadly, Cindy, most direct support professionals are making $10 or less an hour. You know, they don't have high school degrees, and so they themselves are living in poverty, right? And so that's a huge concern. And then if they're the person that's sort of the advocate for a person with a disability, or even the person that's cooking for them, how do we expect that individual with disabilities to have good food if the staff themselves don't have good eating habits? So that's a great that's a great point. I'm gonna yeah. What'd you say?
But yeah, it's just it just points out just there's so much vulnerability surrounding those populations that they're really kind of seen because they're not advocating for themselves. They don't have the abilities to do so.
Exactly, exactly. So I can see two names. Dana, would you like to share? And then Joan, I'm gonna ask you to share, Joan Brundage.
Sure. I was thinking about, my grandma lives in the like an assisted facility, basically a rehabilitation, has been there for a while. And they have meetings that actually invite family to come in and talk about what some of the actual residents want. Do they want to eat? And then they're putting on healthy information for them on menus. They're including them on all of the exercising, because instead of just them rolling out a plan, because all of them can't do it, they're actually, if they're able to voice, or their family member is able to voice what they want to do or can do or need to do for mental health and while they're in the facility, and physical health. That's something that I've kind of seen in our area as well. And I also wanted to bring up too, I hadn't really thought much about this, with the social media and things that we put on as the health center, whatever our events are for our outdoor swim, but the individuals that sometimes are even blind, how are they seeing that social media? How are they, and typically the demographics are on a lower scale as far as pay wage and that kind of thing, or on disability. But how is a blind person going to see all this social media and newspaper? I know we try to include everybody, our demographics are seniors and everything, but I thought, how do someone that was blind have that information? That was my takeaway.
That's great. And you brought up a couple of really great things. With this whole COVID epidemic happening right now, we're relying heavily on telehealth. We're relying heavily on sort of virtual communication around isolation and those different things. And so, as we rely more heavily on that, is one, do people have access to it financially, or even through having Wi-Fi? Do they have the equipment? But two, are you ensuring that the things that you're doing are accessible? So if you're even posting something on your social media page, have you, and it's just a picture, have you tagged it correctly? If you're posting a really cool video, is it captioned? And those are all things that should just become, you should not put a picture up unless you put the caption underneath it. You should not, put a video up unless it's captioned. And those should just become ingrained in the way you do the things that you do. I personally don't like to put headphones on every time I see a video, but I'm always looking at videos when I'm sitting next to my kids. So I want it captioned. So it's a universal concept, right? So definitely, you bring up great points, Dana. Joan, do you mind sharing some of your aha or thoughts you have? You're muted still.
I called them. This is Joanne from Schuyler. Some of the things that we are looking at here, it's some of the things that we were not aware of or didn't think about because we are not disabled. So we don't think about some of the things that to include people with disabilities, because we are a very small county and we do not have a lot of resources, and a lot of the resources are in the neighboring county. So it's kind of brought light to, we need to be thinking about these things. Until we have to actually deal with somebody with disabilities, we're not thinking of those, that it may be a hindrance to people that utilize our facilities or utilize like the county health fair or the county fair, like you said. Those are things that we need to be thinking about, because I think a lot of times we get stuck in our own little world and we don't think about other people and their accessibility. So it just kind of brought to light the things that we need to be thinking about for other people to utilize.
Thank you, Joan. So I'm just going to pick on a few people on this list, and hopefully they have mics. Alicia, I'm going to unmute you. Maybe. I can't unmute her. Catherine, can you unmute her? Alicia, are you able? Oh, Alicia just brought up that she's not forget about those with DD who still use tobacco or alcohol. The other thing, and now that you brought that up, that I wanted, that it triggered for me, is that a lot of people with developmental disabilities have sex, and they do not receive any information in high school. They're typically taken out of their middle school and high school classes when it talks about health and their bodies and how to protect themselves. But we know people with developmental disabilities are the highest, they are the highest group of people when it comes to sexual, physical, and financial abuse. And so when we start thinking about those programs related to STDs and pregnancies, do not leave out people with disabilities. Looks like Rachel just put a comment up there. In public health, we've learned to be chameleons and adapt to the situation that's been placed in front of us, whether it's specific to our job or not. We've learned to manage without necessary resources, so we've always done our best to adapt. This has just made me mindful to try and address those needs before they're pointed out and arise. For example, we try and keep our literature at a 5th to 7th grade level. Why not include larger print and pictures with it automatically rather than waiting for a request? Because might not speak up and make that request and in turn go unreached. That's fantastic, Rachel, and that's exactly the point. You guys do wonderful things with what you do. And so how do you just like, it's just sometimes just even just to like being more mindful, and it's just a mindset. And so I think you don't have to be so scared sometimes, not that anyone wants to admit it, but you sort of get scared of like, well, how do I include a person with autism or Down syndrome? But all the things that you're doing probably are really good things to do that. And then Brenda also said that a point around the Fall Festival Committee is a good point. We'd love to hear other things as well, but for the sake of time, I just want to give you a few closing thoughts. You know, and I think, Joan, this is to your point, can people see themselves in your programs? So are they not there because they don't need you, don't know about you, or because they don't see themselves in your program? They don't feel included. So, you know, do you have images of people on the website, brochures, informational materials, and not images that like stick out and say, we serve people with disabilities, but rather just show it's just the way you do business. Do you have people with all types of disabilities as staff, volunteers, trainers, advisory members? If you don't, then why do you think they would see themselves in your programs? Do you have people with disabilities helping you to develop and evaluate your programs? The strong phrase in the self-advocacy movement that they rely on is nothing about us without us. And so it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a person with a developmental disability, or you're talking about a person who speaks a different language or is a different religion. How do they see themselves in your programs? And so if they can't see themselves in your program, then it doesn't matter how accessible you make it. And so it's part of that sort of mindset as well. So the next time you put together a brochure, just make sure that just naturally somebody's in a wheelchair doing something, or somebody uses a seeing eye dog or something that you can, someone with Down syndrome. So there's just something to kind of think about. The other sort of closing final remark is that no matter what target population you're focusing on, put yourself in their shoes. So if you were a person with a developmental disabilities and they came to your programs, or they picked up your brochures or went to your website, would they feel included? Would you feel included if you were them? And to me, that's the ultimate challenge that we ask ourselves when we develop anything. And to me, we always do the best that we can to try to answer that question. There's many times that we maybe can't achieve it to the highest level, but we can try. And that to me is really what the Universal Strategies Triangle is all about. So that really concludes what I wanted to share with you today. I hope that this was helpful for you. I hope that it kind of gave you some new ideas, or sort of helped you think differently about inclusion. There is a post-evaluation poll going on right now. I think, do they also get one on their email too, Christy? And you'll also get a second one. This is just a quick down and dirty one. But if we'd really appreciate you filling out that second one. I hope this was interesting to you. it's very interactive if we were able to do it in person, because we'd really be able, if you had a group of stakeholders sitting around, you're able to really pull all their different ideas in and really build these triangles very specific to your community. Many of them you can try on your own. You could always email me if you want me to help you build a triangle, or if you wanted to even try facilitating that with a coalition yourself. But we're right here in Kansas City. We love to share this. We think it's important not only for people with disabilities, but really all populations. So try applying it to other populations that you work with as well. So any questions? I'm available. My email's there. This PowerPoint can be made available. This is also recorded. So I don't know if Pat or Christy or Kelly, or those of you that asked me to do this, had any sort of wrap-ups or final reflections or anything. Pat, would you like to share anything?
I just want to say thank you again, Shelley, for this presentation. It was really, I think, helpful and helped us kind of, think about things in a little bit different way. So we really appreciate your time and to present this to us this morning.
Absolutely.
Does anybody have any questions? Okay, well, I'm not hearing anything, and I don't see anything in the chat box. So again, I'll just emphasize again to please, when you get the link for the post survey, to complete that as you're able. And
Great.
thank everyone.
And Pat and Christy, Kelly and Catherine, if you want to stay on for a few minutes, please. Yes, Brenda, we can get you the slides.
Yeah, they'll be posted to Healthy Link, and that the recording will be as well.
Great. As soon as you finish your survey, you are more than welcome to log off. Thank you, everyone, for participating. We appreciate everything you do.
Thank you.